Hello everyone, my name is Roy Jafari and I would like to welcome you to another video. In this video we're going to continue our discussion on ethics of data modeling. In the previous video we talked about general perspectives about modeling. What is a model, how we go about modeling, and we created some foundational ideas, mainly 7 dimensions of ethical perspectives on modeling. And now in this video we're going to continue that discussion, but this time we're going to focus on one of the models, one of the data models that we use very often in data analytics, data manipulations, and data mining, and that is the model of nominal data. Nominal data is a measurement, and based on this measurement we are modeling populations of entities, and we measure these populations of entities by this one model of measuring. Alright, so let's look at this slide. So in the previous video we talked about the general model theory, and we talked about a model has basically 3 characteristics. It's a mapping of a reality, a things, an object, a system, an organization. It's basically mapping something, and then this mapping has an element of reduction. We are reducing that reality into something simpler, something more concise, something easier to understand. So there is a reduction that happens, and then that reduction happens and we accept that reduction because we are getting some usefulness, that the aspect of pragmatism of the model. So let's start this conversation with an example. For instance, we use the form of government, which is a nominal attribute, to measure all the countries in the world, right? So we measure each country using this metric, which is a nominal metric, right? So for instance, we see some part of these countries, but there are actually more. You can see that this metric has been used to measure all of the countries that are in the world. So this list is rather long, so this is just gonna continue going till it gets to the end of the list. But the point is not for us to look at all the measurements that has been done. The point is to understand the ethical perspectives and ethical aspects of this measurement and this sort of like modeling these countries using this nominal measurements. So let's talk about that 3 characteristics of general model theory that we talked about. We are mapping. What is it that we're mapping? We are mapping populations of countries, right? So we are mapping all the countries in the world, and each country is being mapped and is being measured. What are we reducing? So of course a country has many different perspectives, right? It has many different aspects: historical, geographical. Their map is different. Their history is different. There are a lot of different things that one could sort of like talk about and measure about a country. But here we reduce all of those and we stick with just one thing, and that's form of government. And then pragmatism. Why is this useful and how can this be useful? Well, we could use this metric to evaluate and compare countries, and also perhaps have some summarization of the whole world as far as their form of government. So now let's start talking about those 7 ethical dimensions of modeling. So the first thing is we have to always be aware that model is a model. Model is not a reality, and that's very important. It's always one of the most important things, that when you're using a model, you want to remember that it's the reduced version. It's reduced for some pragmatism. So you want to only use the model when it makes sense, the cost-benefit analysis that we're going to talk about. So we always want to remember that. If we are one individual decision maker, or if we are an organization that we are making a decision. So that's understanding is very key. The next one is efforts in making the implicit assumptions explicit. So what are some of the implicit assumptions here? So for instance, we are assuming that the only aspect of a country that is important is the form of government. The other aspects, such as the major religion, the major language, the history, the geographical understanding, the geology, all of those things does not matter about the country. The only thing that matters is the form of government. And we are also implicitly assuming that we can only describe these countries by one of these predetermined possibilities, right? And all of the countries in the world can be fairly described by these possibilities. It's not the case that one country can be described by a new possibility that is not listed here, or a country can be described by a combination of these possibilities. So when we make the implicit assumption explicit and list them, we also want to pay attention why we do that. We do that because when we create a model such as this, we want to always make sure that everyone who perhaps is going to be using the model is going to be aware of these assumptions. At the same time, we will see that we will use these assumptions in the cost-benefit analysis that we are going to see in one of the bullets that we're going to talk in this video. We also want to pay attention to the cost of assumptions. So for instance, here, what are the cost of assumptions? So for instance, the first assumption, the only aspect of a country that is important is the form of government. What is the cost of this? The cost is the other aspect of the countries, such as history, language, geography, so on and so on, are going to be overshadowed when you measure the country only by this metric. Another assumption was, the form of a government can be described by one of the following possibilities, one of those possibilities. What's the cost here? The cost is that there might be a country that a newer category might do a better job describing them than, or a combination of the categories can describe them better. We also want to be very clear about how the model is useful. So for instance here, if we use this model appropriately, we can use the model to summarize the evolution of political government and political aspects of the whole globe in the history and the time, so we can see what is the trend in the form of government in the whole world. Also, we can be perhaps using this nominal measurement for creating international coalitions and bilateral relationships. And also, we want to make sure that we understand the benefits and the costs, so we can do cost-benefit analysis. So the cost-benefit analysis could look like something like this here. So for instance, the cost is, if we take this matrix too important, one of these possibilities might become so important for the countries to have. Some countries might fake that they have this specific possibilities of this form of government, such as democracy. Or it could be the case, if this metric becomes too important, the country who is in charge of regulating and observing or measuring, using this metric to measure other countries, might measure a country by mistake, or measure a country intentionally, wrongly, for their own political reasons. What are the benefits? We kind of talked about them. It could help summarize the governance world. It could be useful for forming international relationship, and also it could be used as a way to aid emerging countries, emerging democracies and countries. We also want to pay attention that, like any models, this model is also, subject to overusing and abusing. So what would be a case of misusing and overusing. For instance, WHO could, I'm not saying this is what happened, actually this is exactly the opposite of what's happening, but let's say WHO, World Health Organization, with the hope of encouraging democracy, give more COVID-19 vaccines to countries that have stronger democracies, which is, overusing this model, because COVID-19 is a humanitarian case, and we don't want to use this metric for such cases, right? This is an example of misusing this metric. How about abusing, like we mentioned during this video, the country that uses these metrics to actually measure different countries might wrongly measure a country for political reasons. So they're abusing this metric for political gain intentionally. Alright, so in this video we saw an example of sort of like how we could use the foundation of ethical modeling that we created in the previous video to apply it to an example of nominal metric. A nominal metric, which is a model that we can use to measure a population. Alright, until next video.